Here we're going to look at configuring AAA authentication on a Cisco router that will authenticate against a Radius server. In this particular instance, we're going to use WinRadius. Previously, we looked at local, or using the local database for AAA, and now we're going to use the server, so it's a little bit different. In order to do this, we've created this small network, and so this is, in a very basic sense, how our network looks. Likely in real life, you would be, maybe telnetting or actually SSHing from your home into the device, or there's some sort of distance between you, although you could have certainly used them within your internal LAN, but this is a simplistic view of it. So basically my user, here's the IP address of my user down here. It's 192.168.1.100. The Radius server's IP address is 192.168.1.11. And what's going to happen is my user is going to try to telnet into R1, and we've got to configure it so when user goes in to R1, so my user is going to go in, it's going to go all the way through the switch, and he wants to telnet into R1. R1 says, well, wait a minute, I'm going to be configured to use Radius, so before I can respond to you, I'm going to give you the username prompt, you enter your username, and then I'm going to check the Radius server. Between R1 and the Radius server, in this instance, we're going to use Radius as the protocol. That's why we refer to it as a Radius server. So I send the username to the Radius server, says, yep, I have that user, responds, lets me know. Then I can go ahead and I can prompt that user for a password. The user sends back the password. Between R1 and the Radius server, so this doesn't happen over here, R1's the client in this instance. R1 then sends the password to the Radius server and basically in a sense says, hey, do you have this username password combination? If it does, we go ahead and it says go ahead and authenticate them through, and we allow the user access. So now my user has access to do whatever it is I'm allowing him to do on R1. That's basically what we're going to configure. We're just going to configure AAA authentication to authenticate against a Radius server, and we'll demonstrate configuring the Radius server also. Alright, so now we're into our router R1, and we're going to configure to use the Radius server with AAA. But remember when we talked about method lists earlier in the theory portion, that we said we could have up to 4 methods? We're going to configure 2 methods, the first being the Radius server group, and the second being the local database or local username and password. That way, if for some reason the router can't contact the Radius server or the Radius server itself is totally down, it'll go ahead and allow me to use the local username and password that's configured. So let's do that first. Enable, go into global config mode, and our username will be test user, and our password will be test pass. Okay. And then let's enable AAA with the AAA new model command. Now let's go ahead and configure our authentication method list, AAA authentication. Now we're going to give it a name, so we'll log in. And remember, as we saw earlier when we did the local one, we could give it its own name, or we could use the default list. We're actually going to give it a name. We're going to use this AAA authentication method to authenticate users trying to telnet into the router. So they're remotely accessing the router. And so we're going to apply this one to the V2Y lines. And since we're going to do that, we're going to name this list V2Y lines. Okay. And then the group first method is Radius. And then we're going to use local. So AAA authentication login. The name is V2Y lines, group, Radius, local. Now we have to, remember when we talked about earlier with some of the theory, we said that Radius had legacy ports that it had used for authentication, authorization, and accounting, and it had newer ports that it used. So we want to ensure that we're using the newer port numbers because our Radius server is going to be using the newer port numbers. So along with defining or letting AAA or letting the router know where our Radius server is, how it can be contacted with this IP address, we're also going to include our authorization and authentication port and our accounting port. And then we're going to give it a key or a password. That password's used between the router and the Radius server, just between those two, to ensure that their communications is a little more secure. So if their passwords don't match, the router and the Radius server won't communicate with each other. So the command is Radius server host. And remember from our picture, our IP address was 192.168.1.11. This is the IP address of the Radius server. Oh. The auth port is 1812 and the accounting port is 1813. And our key is going to be test radius. Key is just the password that's going to be used between the Radius server and the router, or the client in this case. And then press enter. Now remember we said we wanted to use this on the VTY line, so now we've got to apply this to the VTY line. So we do line VTY 0 space 4, and then we do login, authentication, VTY lines, and press enter. All right, now let's exit back out. Now we've got to configure our Radius server. So I just have a machine that's running Windows XP on it that I've installed WinRadius on. So we're going to double click the WinRadius folder, and then we're going to start WinRadius by double clicking this icon here. Let's go ahead and we're going to clear our logs, because we're going to go through the steps from the beginning. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go to Settings, Database. This is the name of the database. I'm going to have it configured automatically. And then click OK. And it tells me that it was, and it's going to tell me I have to restart. But first, let's go ahead and add users. So we're going to go to Operation. Move this down just a little bit. Operation, Add User. We're going to add our test user and our password of being test pass. The rest of the stuff we're not worried about. We're going to click OK. Now we've added our user. Now we're going to close it and restart it because it wants us to restart since we made a major change. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close. And then we'll just restart it. And it's telling us that everything is okay. Our users weren't loaded though, so we might want to double check that. So let's add our user again just in case. Might not like that I did both of them at the same time. So we added the user successfully. Now that that's done, we're going to go into our, remember when I showed you the picture in the beginning, we had a router connected to a switch, and then we had a host computer that we named user, and we had another computer that was the Radius server. So this here is the Radius server. We're going to go into our host computer. Let's go ahead and bring him over. And we're going to open a command prompt. Now let's go ahead and telnet to our router 192.168.1.1. Notice it asked me for the username. The username should be test user, and the password should be test pass. And I'm in. So let's go see how we can tell that we authenticate. One, we're in, right? But we also did have where we configured if for some reason the Radius server was down, that it would use the local database. So let's just double check and make sure that it actually used the Radius server. Now I've opened up the Radius server window, or a window for the Radius server, so that we can see this information again, and you can see that test user authenticated OK. Once you see that, then you know you used the Radius server to authenticate. So now my users coming from outside router 1 or R1 are authenticating, or this particular user is authenticating using the Radius server. And I could do many more users in here. I could do some accounting in here. I look at some of the logs. There's all kinds of things we could do. But this instance was just to show you how to configure AAA authentication, use a WinRadius server for that, and that's it. We have successfully done it. So we can go ahead and we'll just minimize our Radius server in case we want to use it later, and we'll close that. And it's minimized down there. Some of you will run into a thing where you think you closed it and you really minimized it. So double check. If you think nothing is coming up in your Radius server window, double check that you don't have a bunch of these little WinRadius symbols if you're using WinRadius to kind of test things and play with things. If you have a bunch of them, then chances are it could be communicating with your Radius server. It's just in one of the other windows. But that's it.